Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. There are love stories that burn bright and brief, consuming everything in their passionate flames before fading into memory. And then there are loves that stretch across eternity itself, unchanging and undying, preserved in a moment that never ends. The tale of Selene and Endymion belongs to this second category, a romance frozen in time like moonlight captured in silver, beautiful and haunting in equal measure. It's a story that asks us to consider what we would sacrifice for love, and whether eternal devotion can exist when only one lover remains awake to feel it. Picture, if you will, the ancient Greek night sky. Not the light-polluted heavens we know today, but a cosmos so vivid and clear that every star seemed close enough to touch. Against this celestial canvas, a silver chariot would glide each night, pulled by horses as white as freshly fallen snow, driven by a goddess whose beauty rivaled the luminous orb that followed in her wake. This was Selene, the moon personified, the gentle light in darkness, the marker of time's passage. And somewhere far below, in a cave carved into the slopes of a mountain in Korea, a mortal man lay sleeping, the most beautiful human the world had ever seen. Between these two beings, separated by the vast gulf between divine and mortal, between wakefulness and eternal slumber, existed a love that would inspire artists and poets for thousands of years to come. Tonight, we descend into the shadows and the silver light to discover their story. We'll explore the goddess who ruled the night sky, the mortal who captured her immortal heart, and the choice that bound them together in a union that is both the most romantic and most tragic tale in all of Greek mythology. So settle in. Let the world around you fade away, and allow yourself to be transported to an ancient time when gods walked among mortals, and love could bridge even the space between earth and sky. The goddess who ruled the night. Before we can understand the depth of Selene's love, we must first know who she was, this radiant being who illuminated the darkness and measured the passage of time itself. Selene was born during the age of Titans, that primordial generation of divine beings who ruled before the Olympian gods we're more familiar with, claimed dominion over the cosmos. Her parents were Hyperion and Theia, titans of heavenly light and sight, respectively. From her father, she inherited dominion over celestial radiance. and from her mother, the ability to see all that transpired beneath her watchful gaze. She was sister to two equally important celestial deities, Helios, who drove the sun across the sky each day, and Eos, the rosy-fingered goddess of dawn, who bridged the gap between her siblings' domains, heralding the sun's arrival and the moon's departure. The ancient Greeks called her Selene, a name intrinsically connected to Selus, their word for light or radiance. She was also known by other names, Menai, which simply meant moon, and sometimes Phoebe, the bright one, though this title was shared with her grandmother, another Titaness. To the Romans, she would later be known as Luna, a name that still echoes through our language today in words like lunar and lunacy. That last term, a reflection of the ancient belief that the moon could influence human minds and emotions. Physical descriptions of Selene paint her as breathtakingly beautiful, as befitting the personification of the moon itself. Ancient poets described her as a woman of ethereal loveliness, with skin so pale it seemed to glow with its own inner light, as if she were crafted from moonbeams made flesh. Upon her head, she wore a crown fashioned in the shape of a crescent moon, though some accounts describe this as bull's horns with the moon's disk nestled between them, a symbol of both her celestial nature and her power. Her garments were described as flowing and luminous, seeming to shimmer and shift like moonlight on water, never quite solid, always moving with an otherworldly grace. But Selene was more than just beautiful. She was one of the all-seeing eyes of the cosmos. Just as her brother Helios could observe all that transpired during the day, Selene watched over the world during the night. No secret was hidden from her gentle but penetrating gaze. She witnessed lovers meeting in secret groves, thieves sneaking through shadowed streets, midnight rituals in sacred places, and the quiet sorrows of those who could not sleep. She saw everything, yet she remained serene and distant, a silent observer of mortal affairs, her face eternally calm as she pursued her nightly journey across the heavens. Every evening, as her brother Helios completed his daily journey and descended in the west, Selene would begin her preparations. Ancient texts tell us that she would first bathe in the waters of Oceanus, that great river that the Greeks believed encircled the entire world. In those primordial waters, she would cleanse herself of the previous night's journey, washing away the dust of the stars and preparing herself for the path ahead. Then, refreshed and radiant, she would ascend to her chariot. This was no ordinary vehicle. Selene's chariot was crafted from silver that never tarnished, forged in workshops beyond mortal reach by divine craftsmen, whose skills exceeded any earthly smith. It gleamed with a soft, cool radiance that stood in stark contrast to the blazing gold of her brother's solar chariot. Some accounts describe it as being pulled by 2 horses, pristine white steeds whose coats held the luster of pearls and whose hooves made no sound as they galloped through the air. Other versions speak of oxen or bulls as her draft animals, massive and powerful, their white hides glowing against the darkness of the night sky. These animals were no ordinary beasts, but divine creatures who could traverse the celestial sphere without tiring, maintaining the same steady pace night after night, year after year, never faltering in their cosmic duty. As Selene drove her chariot from east to west, the moon followed in her wake. To the ancient Greeks, this explained the moon's movement across the night sky, its predictable pas from horizon to horizon. But Selene's influence extended far beyond mere celestial mechanics. She governed the lunar cycles, those mysterious phases that transformed the moon from a thin crescent to a perfect full circle, and back again. These phases were more than just astronomical curiosities to the ancient world. They were the markers by which people measured time, planned their festivals, and organized their lives. The connection between Selene and the measurement of time was profound and practical. The lunar month, the period from one new moon to the next, became a fundamental unit in Greek timekeeping. The ancient Greek calendar was primarily lunar, with months beginning at each new moon. Festivals were timed to specific phases, and important events were scheduled according to the moon's position in its cycle. Agricultural activities followed lunar rhythms, as farmers believed that planting, harvesting, and other tasks were more successful when performed during certain phases of the moon. Even religious observances honored Selene particularly at the new moon and full moon, times when her power was considered especially potent. Beyond her role as timekeeper, Selene held dominion over other aspects of the natural world. The tides, though the ancient Greeks didn't fully understand their connection to the moon, were nevertheless associated with lunar influence. Women's menstrual cycles, which roughly corresponded to the lunar month, were seen as being under Selene's governance, linking the goddess to fertility and the mysteries of female reproduction. Night dew, that moisture that appeared mysteriously on plants and grass each morning, was considered a gift from Selene, her presence leaving a tangible blessing on the earth. Some accounts even claimed that one of her daughters with Zeus was named Ursa, the personification of dew itself. The moon's association with madness, what we still call lunacy today, also fell under Selene's domain. The ancient Greeks noticed that some forms of mental illness seemed to worsen during certain phases of the moon, particularly the full moon. They believed that Selene's light could influence the mind, causing strange behaviors, vivid dreams, and emotional upheavals in those susceptible to such effects. This wasn't seen as malicious on the goddess's part, just another aspect of her vast power over the nighttime world. Selene's position in the divine hierarchy was somewhat unique. She was a Titaness, belonging to the older generation of gods who had been displaced when Zeus and his Olympian siblings overthrew their father Cronus and claimed dominion over the cosmos. However, unlike many of her fellow Titans who were imprisoned in Tartarus or pushed to the margins of divine society, Selene retained her position and her power. This was partly because her role was so essential, and partly because she and her siblings, Helios and Eos, had apparently not opposed Zeus during the great war between Olympians and Titans. They continued their celestial duties regardless of who held ultimate power, their functions too vital to the cosmic order to be disrupted by divine politics. As time passed and Greek religion evolved, Selene's importance began to blend with that of Artemis, the Olympian goddess of the hunt and wilderness. Artemis, daughter of Zeus and twin sister to Apollo, gradually absorbed many of Selene's lunar attributes. Just as Apollo came to be associated with the sun, taking on aspects of Helios's solar dominion, Artemis became linked with the moon. However, there was a crucial difference in how this association played out for Selene versus her brother. While Helios's stories could sometimes be transferred to Apollo, Selene's most famous tale, her love for Endymion, could never be given to Artemis. This was because Artemis was one of the virgin goddesses, taking a vow of eternal chastity and spurning all romantic and sexual relationships. The passionate, deeply sensual story of Selene and Endymion was fundamentally incompatible with Artemis's character. Thus, even as Selene's general prominence in Greek religion faded somewhat, this particular myth remained uniquely hers, preserving her memory in a way that her other attributes could not. Yet despite all her power, despite her beauty and her eternal nature, despite the reverence with which mortals regarded her, and the cosmic importance of her nightly journey, Selene experienced something that would transform her existence and reveal that even gods could be vulnerable to the most mortal of emotions. That something was love, unexpected and all-consuming, for a mortal man whose beauty outshone even her own divine radiance. The ancient sources don't tell us when or why Selene first began to pay closer attention to the earth below her. Perhaps after countless centuries of her nightly journey, always following the same path, always maintaining the same distance from the world she illuminated, she simply yearned for something more. Perhaps her all-seeing gaze had witnessed so many mortal love stories that she longed to experience such connection herself. Or perhaps it was simply fate, that inexorable force that governed even the gods, directing her attention to one particular place on one particular night. What we know is this: on that fateful evening, as Selene drove her chariot across the sky, her luminous gaze fell upon the region of Korea in western Anatolia. There, rising from the landscape, stood Mount Latmus, a peak that would become forever associated with her story. The mountain was significant in its own right, considered sacred, its slopes dotted with caves that had served as dwelling places and shrines since ancient times. The area around it had once been a gulf, though it would eventually silt up to become a lake, and the nearby settlement of Heraclea at Latmus would claim Endymion's tomb within their territory. But on this night, geography and history mattered little. What captured Selene's attention, what caused her to momentarily forget her celestial duty, was a sight of such perfect beauty that it arrested her divine heart. In a cave on Mount Latmus, illuminated by the very moonlight she cast upon the world, lay a young man asleep. And in that moment, the eternal and unchanging nature of Selene's existence shattered like a reflection on disturbed water, and nothing would ever be the same again. The most beautiful mortal. Who was this man whose beauty could captivate a goddess? The ancient sources offer us multiple, often contradictory accounts, each preserving different traditions about Endymion's origins and nature. This multiplicity of stories speaks to how deeply his myth was embedded in Greek culture, with different regions and time periods claiming him as their own and shaping his tale to fit their local traditions. In some versions, Endymion was royalty, a king who ruled in Elis, a region in the western Peloponnese that was home to Olympia and the Olympic Games. These accounts make him the son of Aethleus and Callis, or in some tellings, the son of Zeus himself and Callis, which would give him divine blood and make him a demigod. According to these kingly traditions, Endymion was a ruler who had led colonists from Thessaly to establish his kingdom in Elis. He was said to have had at least 3 sons, Epeius, Paeon, and Aeolus, and to have held a great race among them to determine his successor. Epeius won this contest, and the people of his kingdom became known as the Epeans after him. When Endymion died in these versions, he was buried at Olympia, right at the starting line of the race course, his tomb becoming a memorial to both a king and a father. But the Endymion who captured Selene's heart wasn't this king in Elis. That version of his story dealt with mortal politics, succession, and the founding of kingdoms. The Endymion of the love story was different, associated not with Elis, but with Caria, that region in western Anatolia where Mount Latmus rose toward the sky. Some ancient sources attempted to reconcile these two traditions by suggesting that Endymion had been king in Elis, but later traveled to Mount Latmus in Caria. Though the geographical leap across the Aegean Sea seems more like an attempt to merge contradictory stories than historical truth. In the Romantic tradition, the one that concerns us tonight, Endymion was described variously as a shepherd, a hunter, or perhaps both. These were fitting occupations for someone who would spend his nights on mountainsides, alone with the stars and the moon. As a shepherd, he would tend his flocks on the slopes of Mount Latmus, finding shelter in the caves that dotted the mountain when he needed rest. The life of a shepherd in ancient Greece was often solitary, requiring long hours in remote places, watching over sheep or goats as they grazed. It was peaceful work, but lonely, giving one plenty of time for contemplation beneath the vast sweep of the heavens. As a hunter, Endymion would have been even more connected to the wild places, tracking prey through forests and across rocky terrain, learning to move silently through the darkness, guided by moonlight. Hunting, particularly night hunting, would have made him intimately familiar with Selene's cycles, knowing which phases provided enough light for tracking and which left the world too dark to see. Either occupation placed him in the perfect position for a goddess of the night to observe him, out in the open and alone, illuminated by her gentle radiance. There's one more intriguing version of Endymion's identity that's worth considering. The Roman scholar Pliny the Elder proposed that Endymion was actually an astronomer, one of the first humans to seriously study the movements of the moon. In this interpretation, his love affair with Selene becomes a metaphor for his dedicated observation and understanding of lunar cycles. He would spend his nights not sleeping, but watching, tracking the moon's path across the sky, noting its phases, perhaps even beginning to understand its patterns and predict its movements. In this telling, his relationship with the moon goddess represents humanity's first attempts to scientifically comprehend celestial mechanics, to bring reason and understanding to the mysterious light that ruled the night. But regardless of whether we imagine Endymion as shepherd, hunter, astronomer, or some combination thereof, all sources agree on one crucial point. He was extraordinarily beautiful. Ancient writers describe him with language usually reserved for gods themselves. His beauty was said to be unmatched among mortals, so perfect that it seemed divine rather than human. We can imagine him as young, probably in his late teens or early 20s. That perfect moment of youth when the boy has become a man but hasn't yet been marked by the hardships of life. His face would have been finely formed, with regular features that seemed almost sculpted, his body athletic and strong from his outdoor life, but not coarse or rough. The ancient Greeks had very specific ideas about masculine beauty. They valued symmetry and proportion, bodies that were neither too muscular nor too soft, faces that combined strength with refinement. They appreciated smooth skin, unmarred by excessive weathering, though a healthy glow from time spent outdoors was desirable. Hair was important too, with thick, well-formed curls being particularly admired. Based on artistic depictions that have survived, we might envision Endymion with dark, wavy hair, olive skin common to the Mediterranean region, and features that were perfectly balanced, each element of his face contributing to an overall impression of harmony and grace. But physical beauty alone, however perfect, doesn't quite explain the depth of Selene's reaction to him. There must have been something more, some quality that transcended mere appearance. Perhaps it was an innocence about him, a purity of spirit that showed in his face even in sleep. Perhaps it was a gentle nature, a kindness that softened his features and made him seem approachable despite his divine level beauty. Or perhaps it was simply the way he looked in sleep, peaceful and vulnerable, all defenses down, his face relaxed in whatever dreams occupied his slumbering mind. The ancient writer Licymnius preserved a particularly touching detail about Endymion's appearance in sleep. He wrote that Hypnos, the god of sleep himself, was so taken with Endymion's beauty that he allowed him to sleep with his eyes open. This way, even in slumber, Endymion could gaze upon Selene as she gazed upon him, their eyes meeting across the divide between wakefulness and dreams. Whether we take this literally or as poetic metaphor, it speaks to something essential about their relationship. this idea of seeing and being seen, of recognition passing between mortal and divine. The cave where Endymion slept was itself significant. Caves held special meaning in Greek religion and mythology. They were liminal spaces, thresholds between the surface world and the mysterious realms beneath the earth. They were associated with prophecy, with mystery cults, with places where the divine could more easily interact with the mortal. Many caves were considered sacred, dedicated to various deities, or used for religious rituals. The cave on Mount Latmus, where Endymion rested, would eventually become a shrine, a holy place associated with the goddess's visitation and the eternal sleep of her beloved. Archaeological evidence from the Mount Latmus region confirms the area's religious significance. Excavations have revealed a sanctuary that may have been dedicated to Endymion, dating from the Hellenistic period. The ancient city of Heraclea at Latmus, built at the foot of Mount Latmus, preserved traditions about Endymion's tomb being located somewhere on the mountain. While the exact location of the cave from the myth remains uncertain, the historical reality of the area's sacred status lends weight to the story's geographical claims. This wasn't just any mountain in just any location. It was a place already imbued with spiritual significance, making it a fitting setting for a love story between goddess and mortal. Into this sacred space, night after night, Selene would descend, abandoning her chariot and her cosmic duty to be near the sleeping shepherd. What she felt in those moments, what emotions coursed through her immortal heart, we can only imagine. But they must have been powerful beyond measure, for they would lead her to make a choice that would define both their existences for eternity. The descent of love. That first night, when Selene's gaze fell upon Endymion sleeping in his cave, something fundamental shifted in the cosmos. For the first time in her eternal existence, the moon goddess felt her heart move with an emotion she had perhaps witnessed in countless mortals, but had never experienced herself. It wasn't mere desire, though that was certainly present. It was something deeper and more complex, a recognition of beauty so profound that it bordered on the sacred, mixed with a longing that ached through her immortal essence. The ancient poets try to capture this moment with language that emphasizes its immediacy and totality. They tell us that Selene fell in love instantly, that the sight of Endymion struck her like a thunderbolt, leaving her no choice but to love him. This wasn't a gradual affection that grew over time, but rather a sudden and overwhelming passion that consumed her from the first moment she saw him. The Greeks had a specific concept for this kind of love: eros, passionate, and often overwhelming desire, as opposed to philia, the love of friendship, or storge, familial affection. What Selene felt was pure eros, that irresistible force that even the gods couldn't control once it took hold. But falling in love and acting on that love are two different things, especially when one party is a divine being with cosmic responsibilities, and the other is a sleeping mortal. Selene couldn't simply wake Endymion and declare her feelings. Beyond the obvious, practical difficulties, there were metaphysical barriers between them. She was immortal, eternal, unchanging. He was mortal, temporary, destined to age and die within the span of a single human lifetime that would pass in the blink of an eye from her cosmic perspective. She was a goddess with powers and responsibilities that stretched across the sky. He was a human, living a simple life on a mountainside, concerned with sheep and perhaps the next day's weather. Despite all these obstacles, or perhaps because of them, Selene found herself unable to stay away. Night after night, she would approach Mount Latmus during her celestial journey. As she drew near, she would slow her chariot, allowing the moon to linger longer over this particular stretch of landscape than it should. She would gaze down at the cave where Endymion slept, bathing him in her silvery light, watching the way the moonbeams played across his features, highlighting the curve of his cheek, the line of his jaw, the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. But gazing from afar wasn't enough. The ancient sources tell us that Selene would actually descend from her chariot, leaving it suspended in the sky, or perhaps entrusting it temporarily to another, and would come down to earth to be near her beloved. This wasn't something gods did lightly. The divine realm and the mortal world were meant to be separate, with clear boundaries between them. Gods could interact with mortals, certainly, but there was always meant to be distance, a recognition of the fundamental difference in their natures. By descending from her cosmic path to visit a sleeping shepherd, Selene was crossing boundaries, both literally and metaphorically. We can imagine how these visits might have proceeded. Selene, accustomed to viewing the world from the heights of heaven, would find herself standing on solid earth, perhaps for the first time in ages. The cave would be cool and dark, where her moonlight didn't reach, carrying the scent of stone and earth and whatever simple bedding Endymion used for sleep. She would move quietly, not wanting to disturb him, approaching where he lay, and then, finally close enough to touch, she would simply look at him. The ancient writers emphasize this aspect of the story. Selene gazing upon Endymion, watching him sleep. There's something profound in this, something that speaks to love as observation, as witness, as the desire to simply exist in the beloved's presence without need for interaction or acknowledgement. She would study every detail of him, memorizing the contours of his face, the exact shade of his hair, the way his lashes rested against his cheeks, the slight smile that sometimes touched his lips as he dreamed. The poet Quintus Smyrnaeus, writing many centuries after the myth's origin, preserved a beautiful detail about these visits. He describes how, in the area around where Endymion slept, the milk from his herds would flow out onto the ground, creating pools of white liquid that would harden into formations resembling milk, but made of stone. This was said to be a memorial of Selene's couch, suggesting that she didn't merely stand and watch, but actually lay down beside Endymion, spending the night hours stretched out next to him as if they were any mortal couple sharing rest. The image this creates is both touching and melancholy. Here is the goddess of the moon, powerful beyond human comprehension, lying beside a sleeping mortal, unable to truly share the experience with him because he remains locked in slumber. She can feel the warmth of his body next to hers, can hear his breathing, can perhaps even touch his face or his hand, but she cannot converse with him, cannot hear his voice, cannot see his eyes open and looking back at her with recognition and perhaps love. Some versions of the story suggest that there were periods when Endymion was awake for their encounters. In these tellings, Selene would visit him not while he slept, but during his waking hours, appearing to him as the beautiful goddess she was. They would talk through the night, sharing words and thoughts, building a genuine relationship beyond merely physical attraction. These versions often describe Endymion asking Selene to identify herself, with her revealing that she is the moon goddess he has spent so many nights watching traverse the sky. The shepherd boy, who had admired her from afar just as she admired him, finds himself face to face with the object of his admiration. And mutual love blossoms naturally from mutual regard. In these more interactive versions, we can imagine long conversations under the stars. Endymion might have asked her about the heavens, about the nature of the gods, about what it's like to be eternal and unchanging. She might have asked him about mortal life, about what it means to know your existence has an end, about the simple pleasures of human experience that immortals could never truly understand. They would have discovered each other not just as goddess and mortal, but as individuals, learning each other's thoughts and dreams and fears. But whether Endymion was awake for these encounters, or remained asleep throughout. One thing remained constant: the problem of mortality. If he was awake and they truly conversed, then both of them would have been acutely aware that their time together was limited. Each night might be their last, as mortals could die suddenly from illness or accident. And even if Endymion lived a full human lifespan, he would age, his beauty fading year by year, until the young man Selene loved became an old man she might not even recognize. This awareness of mortality's inevitability must have haunted their time together, turning even joyful moments bittersweet. Every laugh, every smile, every moment of connection was shadowed by the knowledge that it couldn't last, that the gulf between divine and mortal was too vast to be permanently bridged through mere love, however strong that love might be. And so, Selene found herself facing a choice, or perhaps more accurately, found herself needing to make a request that would alter the course of both their existences. She couldn't give up her love for Endymion. It had become too integral to her being. But she also couldn't bear the thought of watching him age and die, of time's cruel effects destroying the beauty that had first captured her heart. There had to be another way, some solution that would allow their love to continue without the constant specter of death looming over them. The answer she arrived at was one that would preserve Endymion's youth and beauty forever, but at a cost that makes their story one of the most poignant in all of mythology. She would ask the king of the gods himself, Zeus, to grant Endymion eternal life and eternal youth, but locked in eternal sleep, frozen in that perfect moment of young manhood, he would never age, never sicken, never die. And Selene could visit him for eternity, gazing upon him unchanged, loving him forever, without fear of loss. It was a solution born of desperation and deep love, but also, perhaps, of a certain divine selfishness. For while it gave Selene what she wanted, a beautiful beloved preserved forever in perfect youth, it's questionable what it gave Endymion himself. The decision would spark philosophical debates and alternative interpretations that have continued for thousands of years, asking us to consider whether Selene's choice was an act of love or something more troubling. The sleep that knows no waking, the moment when eternal sleep claimed Endymion, stands at the heart of this myth. Yet the ancient sources offer us multiple, often contradictory versions of how it came to pass. These variations reflect different cultural values and different attempts to grapple with the moral complexity of the situation. Each version tells us something different about the nature of divine love, mortal choice, and the price of immortality. In perhaps the most romantic version, Endymion himself made the choice. In this telling, Zeus took pity on the young mortal who had captured a goddess's heart. Or perhaps Zeus simply found the situation amusing or interesting enough to warrant divine intervention. The king of the gods appeared to Endymion and offered him a remarkable gift, the ability to choose his own destiny. This was an extraordinarily rare offer. Mortals lived and died according to fate's weaving, with little say in the circumstances of their lives or deaths. But here was Zeus offering Endymion agency over his own existence. Presented with this choice, and knowing of Selene's love for him, Endymion made a decision that speaks to the depth of his own feelings. He chose eternal life, eternal youth, but also eternal sleep. In this version, it wasn't Selene requesting that her beloved be put to sleep against his will, but rather Endymion voluntarily accepting this state because it was the only way he could remain with his goddess forever. He would give up consciousness, give up the ability to live and experience life in order to preserve what they had together. It was a sacrifice born of love, a mortal choosing to become something between life and death so that a goddess wouldn't have to endure the pain of loss. There's something beautifully tragic about this version. It presents Endymion as an active participant in his fate, someone who weighed the options and made a conscious choice to accept eternal sleep. It suggests that he loved Selene as deeply as she loved him, enough to sacrifice everything, his future experiences, his potential for other relationships, all the adventures and sorrows and joys that make up a human life, simply to remain forever as the object of her devotion. In this telling, their love is truly mutual, with both parties making sacrifices to preserve it. Another common version places the agency primarily with Selene. In these accounts, it was the moon goddess who approached Zeus with a request. She couldn't bear the thought of Endymion aging and dying, couldn't face a future where his beauty would fade and, eventually, disappear entirely. So she petitioned Zeus to preserve him, to grant him immortality and eternal youth. Zeus, moved by her obvious distress, or perhaps amused by seeing the usually serene moon goddess so consumed by passion, agreed to her request. But there was a condition. Endymion would have to sleep eternally. Perhaps Zeus imposed this requirement, or perhaps it was simply the nature of the gift, that mortal flesh could only sustain eternal youth and immortality if consciousness was removed, if the person existed in a state between life and death. This version raises more troubling questions about consent and the nature of Selene's love. If Endymion didn't choose eternal sleep himself, if it was imposed upon him by Selene's request to Zeus, then what does that say about their relationship? Is it truly love if one party makes such a fundamental decision about the other's existence without their input? Is it obsession, a desire to possess and preserve that prioritizes the lover's needs over the beloved's autonomy? Ancient writers seemed aware of this moral complexity. Some sources try to soften it by suggesting that Selene consulted with Endymion first, that they discussed the options together, and he agreed to the plan. Others imply that Endymion was already asleep when Selene made her request, and that she acted to preserve him in his current state, rather than changing him against his will. But the ambiguity remains, intentionally or not, adding layers of meaning to what might otherwise be a simple romantic tale. Then there are the more cynical versions, ones that paint the eternal sleep as a punishment rather than a gift. In these accounts, Endymion's transgression wasn't falling in love with a goddess, but rather setting his sights too high among the Olympians. These stories claim that Endymion, emboldened by his relationship with Selene, or perhaps just overcome by the hubris that so often led to mortal downfall in Greek myths, attempted to seduce Hera herself, the queen of the gods and Zeus's wife. This was a grave offense, as Hera was notoriously protective of her marriage and vengeful toward those who challenged her position. In punishment for his audacity, Zeus cast Endymion into eternal sleep, ensuring that he could never again aspire to relationships beyond his mortal station. This version fundamentally changes the nature of the story. Instead of a tale of divine love finding a way to transcend mortality, it becomes a cautionary narrative about the dangers of mortal ambition and the strict boundaries that must be maintained between divine and human realms. Selene's nightly visits in this context become almost pathetic. A goddess pining for a mortal who had actually desired someone else, someone more powerful. It strips away the romance and replaces it with irony and a certain bitter humor at divine expense. Yet another tradition, preserved by the ancient travel writer Pausanias, offers a completely different explanation. In his account, Endymion was actually the first person to understand the moon's movements through careful observation and study. His eternal sleep, then, wasn't about preserving beauty or punishing transgression, but rather represented a metaphorical state. Endymion had become so absorbed in studying Selene, so consumed by his astronomical observations, that he was like a man asleep to the rest of the world, aware only of the moon and its cycles. In this rationalized version, the eternal sleep is hyperbole for single-minded dedication, and the love between Selene and Endymion represents the relationship between the celestial object and its devoted observer. Regardless of which version we follow, the result is the same. Endymion enters into a sleep from which he will never wake. The cave on Mount Latmus becomes not just a temporary shelter, but his eternal resting place, a tomb that's also somehow not a tomb, since its occupant isn't truly dead. His body doesn't decay or age. His chest continues to rise and fall with breath. His heart continues to beat, but consciousness never returns. He exists in perpetual twilight, neither fully alive nor properly dead, suspended in a moment that stretches across eternity. The ancient sources describe this sleep with language that emphasizes its unique nature. It's not ordinary sleep, not the kind that can be disturbed by noise or touch or even pain. It's a supernatural slumber, magically imposed or divinely gifted, depending on the version, that holds him completely in its embrace. Some accounts specify that Zeus put him to sleep in a way that would prevent any suffering, ensuring that Endymion wouldn't experience the distress of being trapped in his own unresponsive body. He would simply dream, perhaps pleasant dreams, perhaps dreams of Selene herself, unaware of the centuries passing around him. The location of this eternal sleep varies slightly between sources, but most agree on the general area. A cave on Mount Latmus in Caria. The ancient city of Heraclea at Latmus, which grew up at the mountain's base, claimed to have Endymion's tomb, or sleeping place, within their territory. They made it a point of local pride, incorporating the myth into their civic identity. Visitors to the region could seek out the cave where the eternally young shepherd lay, though whether anyone actually saw him, or if the site was simply designated as his resting place, remains unclear from ancient sources. The cave itself would have been a liminal space, a threshold between worlds. During the day, it would be dark and cool, a refuge from the Mediterranean sun, quiet, except perhaps for the occasional drip of water or flutter of bats. But at night, when Selene's chariot passed overhead, moonlight would penetrate into its depths, illuminating the space with that peculiar silver glow that makes everything seem unreal, dreamlike. In that light, Endymion would lie unchanged, year after year, century after century, bathed in the radiance of the goddess who loved him. And Selene? She continued her nightly journey across the sky, her cosmic duties unchanged. But now her path took on new meaning. Every night she would approach Mount Latmus, and every night she would descend to visit her sleeping beloved. The ancient writers tell us that she never tired of this routine, never grew bored or restless with gazing upon the same unchanging face night after night. For Selene, each visit was as precious as the first. Each moment spent in Endymion's presence, a gift beyond measure. We can imagine the tenderness of these visits. Selene entering the cave, her divine radiance illuminating the space more brightly than any torch could. She would approach where Endymion lay, perhaps on a simple pallet of blankets and furs, or in some versions on a couch of silver that she herself had provided. She would kneel beside him, reaching out to touch his face, feeling the warmth of his skin, the reality of his presence. She might brush his hair back from his forehead, trace the line of his jaw with her fingers, rest her hand over his heart to feel its steady beating. Did she speak to him during these visits? The sources don't say, but we can imagine that she might have. Perhaps she told him about her nightly journey, about the things she observed in the world below, about the changing of seasons and the passage of years. Perhaps she shared her thoughts and feelings, using him as a confidant, even though he couldn't respond. Or perhaps she simply sat in silence, content to be near him, finding peace in his presence that she could find nowhere else in all of creation. The tragedy and the beauty of their situation exists in this paradox. Selene has what she wanted, her beloved preserved forever in perfect youth and beauty, available to her every night without fail. But she's also lost what makes love meaningful: the reciprocity, the shared experience, the mutual giving and receiving that creates true intimacy between two beings. Endymion can't smile at her, can't speak her name, can't reach out to touch her in return. He's present, but absent, there, but not there, a beautiful statue that breathes. Some ancient writers tried to resolve this tension by suggesting that their relationship remained somehow mutual, despite Endymion's slumber. They pointed to the children that Selene bore, evidence that their union continued to be fruitful, despite its unusual nature. But this raises its own questions. Questions about consent and agency that make modern readers particularly uncomfortable. How can someone who's eternally unconscious be a true partner in any relationship, let alone a sexual one? The ancient Greeks, it should be noted, had different concepts of consent and different power dynamics in relationships than modern Western culture. The idea of gods taking mortal lovers, whether those mortals were willing or not, appears throughout Greek mythology without the moral condemnation we might apply today. Divine desire was seen as a force that couldn't be denied or questioned, and mortals were expected to submit to divine will. In this cultural context, Selene's ongoing relationship with the sleeping Endymion wouldn't have raised the ethical concerns it does for contemporary audiences. Yet even acknowledging these cultural differences, there's something inherently melancholy about the situation. Even if we accept the most generous interpretation, that Endymion chose this fate willingly out of love for Selene, that he preferred eternal sleep with her devotion to a normal mortal life without it, we're still left with a relationship that exists only on one side. Selene experiences their love fully, but Endymion, locked in sleep, experiences only dreams, if he experiences anything at all. The ancient writers sometimes tried to soften this sadness by emphasizing the peaceful nature of Endymion's sleep, suggesting that his dreams were pleasant and that he was, in his own way, happy. The detail mentioned earlier, that Hypnos allowed him to sleep with his eyes open so he could gaze upon Selene, tries to create a sense of mutual recognition, even within the sleep. But these feel like attempts to reconcile the irreconcilable, to make palatable a situation that is fundamentally uncomfortable in its implications. What's perhaps most interesting is that the ancient Greeks themselves seemed aware of this discomfort. The story of Selene and Endymion was popular, appearing in art and literature throughout antiquity, but it was often told with a certain wistfulness, an acknowledgement of its bittersweet nature. It wasn't presented as a triumphant tale of love conquering all, but rather as a meditation on love's limitations, on the prices we pay for the things we desire, and on the gap between what we want and what's actually possible. The eternal sleep also functions as a powerful metaphor for death itself, or rather, for the desire to preserve what we love against death's inevitable claim. We all want to freeze time, to keep the people we love exactly as they are in perfect moments, untouched by age or illness or change. Selene's request to Zeus is, in a sense, the ultimate expression of this universal human longing. She finds a way to stop time for Endymion, to preserve him exactly as she first saw him. But the myth shows us the cost of achieving this desire. Yes, Endymion remains forever young and beautiful, but he also remains forever unconscious, forever unavailable for genuine relationship. Selene has preserved the appearance of her beloved, but she's lost the reality of him. He's become, essentially, a beautiful memory, made flesh, unchanging, but also unresponsive. The myth suggests that perhaps the changes we fear, the aging and eventual loss that comes with mortal existence, are actually inseparable from the very things that make love meaningful. Take away the possibility of change and loss, and you take away something essential about the nature of loving connection. Children of moon and dream, Perhaps the most surprising element of the Selene and Endymion myth is that their union, despite its unusual nature, was fruitful. The ancient sources tell us that Selene bore children from her relationship with the sleeping shepherd, offspring who would carry forward the legacy of this divine mortal pairing. The number and identity of these children varies between different accounts, but the most famous tradition holds that Selene gave birth to 50 daughters, collectively known as the Menai. The symbolism of this number is deliberate and profound. 50 lunar months, calculated from new moon to new moon, equals approximately 4 years in the ancient Greek calendar system. This was the interval between celebrations of the Olympic Games, that most sacred of Hellenic competitions held at Olympia in honor of Zeus. The connection between Endymion and the Olympics is preserved in multiple traditions. As mentioned earlier, some versions of his myth made him a king of Elis, the very region where Olympia was located, and credited him with founding or organizing the games. His tomb was said to be located at the Olympic starting line. The 50 daughters, then, represent the 50 months between Olympic celebrations, embodying the lunar measurement of this crucial time period. Each daughter was essentially a personification of 1 month in this cycle, divine beings who existed at the intersection of celestial timekeeping and human religious observation. Their existence transformed Selene's personal love story into something with civic and religious significance, connecting her passion for a mortal shepherd to the wider Greek world's most important athletic and religious festival. But what were these daughters to like? What became of them? Unfortunately, the ancient sources provide few details about the individual Menai. We don't have names for all 50, don't have stories about their adventures or their own relationships and offspring. They remain somewhat abstract, more symbolic than fully realized characters. This might seem strange until we remember that they were personifications of time periods, rather than traditional mythological figures with their own agency and adventures. Their existence was their significance. They didn't need elaborate backstories because their purpose was to embody the lunar months rather than to have independent narratives. However, we do know the name of at least one of Selene's daughters, though her parentage is usually attributed to Zeus rather than Endymion. This was Ursa, whose name means dew, that moisture that appears mysteriously on plants and grass each morning. The connection between dew and the moon was obvious to ancient observers. Dew appeared during the night and was most abundant during clear, cool nights when the moon shone brightest. It made perfect sense that dew would be the daughter of the moon goddess, a tangible gift that Selene left on the earth during her nightly passage. Some sources also mention that Selene bore daughters called Pandia and Nemea to Zeus, though these are separate from the 50 Menai attributed to her relationship with Endymion. Pandia's name suggests all brightness or all of dye, possibly connecting her to the full moon's perfect luminosity. Nemea might be connected to the Nemean Games, another important Greek athletic festival, though the connection is less clear than that between the Menai and the Olympics. The question of how Selene could bear children to the eternally sleeping Endymion is one that the ancient sources don't directly address, probably because it would have seemed obvious to their original audiences. In Greek mythology, divine conception didn't always follow the same rules as human reproduction. Gods could father or bear children in various miraculous ways, and the normal biological requirements could be suspended or altered according to divine will and mythological necessity. We might interpret the 50 daughters symbolically rather than literally. They could represent not actual offspring, but rather the fruits of Selene's devotion, the way her love for Endymion enriched and added meaning to her nightly journey. Each month that passed, each cycle of the moon, from dark to full and back again, was like a child born from their union, a new manifestation of their eternal bond. In this reading, the Menai are metaphors for time itself, for the way love transforms our experience of time's passage, making each moment significant and remembered. Or we might take the daughters at face value, accepting that Selene's visits to the sleeping Endymion resulted in actual offspring through mechanisms that don't require detailed biological explanation. In this interpretation, the Menai become proof that their relationship wasn't entirely one-sided, that somehow, even in sleep, Endymion participated in and contributed to their union. His sleeping body remained potent, capable of generation, even though his consciousness was absent. This would align with the ancient Greek view of sleep as a state that suspended awareness, but not life force, a condition in which the body continued its basic functions even as the mind wandered in dreams. The children themselves, these 50 daughters, born from the union of moon and mortal, would have been interesting beings. As daughters of a goddess and a mortal man, they would technically be demigoddesses, possessing some degree of divine power, but also carrying mortal blood. However, given that their father existed in an eternal, unchanging state that was neither fully alive nor dead, their exact nature becomes even more ambiguous. Were they immortal like their mother? Or would they eventually age and die like their father would have, if not for the eternal sleep? The sources don't tell us, leaving these questions open to speculation. What we can say is that the Menai served an important function in Greek timekeeping and religious observance. The lunar calendar was central to Greek civic and religious life. Festivals were scheduled according to the moon's phases. Months began at the new moon, and important rituals took place at the full moon. By personifying the months as daughters of Selene, the Greeks created a mythological framework that explained and sanctified their calendar system, connecting the practical necessity of measuring time to the divine realm. The link to the Olympic Games adds another layer of significance. The Olympics weren't merely athletic competitions. They were deeply religious events. Truces were called to allow safe travel to Olympia. Sacrifices were made to the gods, and the victors were honored with sacred olive crowns. By connecting Endymion and his daughters to the 4-year Olympic cycle, the myth integrated this crucial festival into the broader cosmic order, represented by Selene's celestial journey. There's something beautiful about imagining these 50 daughters as physical manifestations of the months between Olympic Games. Each one would embody a particular month with its own character and qualities. The daughters, representing summer months, might be bright and warm, while those embodying winter months would be cooler and more reserved. Those associated with spring would carry the energy of renewal and growth, while autumn daughters would have a more contemplative, mature quality. Together, they would form a complete cycle, a family that encompassed the full range of seasonal change and temporal progression. In a way, the Menai serve to make Selene and Endymion's story less tragic. Yes, their primary relationship exists in a strange, one-sided limbo, with Selene loving a sleeping man who cannot return her affection consciously. But through their daughters, their love produces something meaningful that extends beyond their own unusual situation. The Menai go out into the world, marking time, enabling human society to organize itself temporally, connecting celestial movements to earthly needs. They're the positive outcome of what might otherwise be seen as a purely melancholy tale. The daughters also ensure that Endymion's legacy extends beyond his own preserved body, sleeping in a cave. Through them, he becomes father to timekeeping itself, at least the lunar variety. His union with Selene doesn't just satisfy her personal longing, but serves a cosmic function, producing divine beings who help structure human experience of time. A mortal shepherd, elevated through a goddess's love into an eternal sleep, becomes progenitor to the forces that measure the passage of months and years. It's a form of immortality, different from his preserved body, but perhaps more significant. His genetic legacy living on in beings who would exist as long as humans needed to measure time by the moon. Modern readers might find it easier to focus on the daughters rather than dwell on the uncomfortable aspects of Selene and Endymion's relationship. The Menai represent something uncomplicated and good, the measurement of time, the cycling of months, the structure that allows human civilization to coordinate and plan. They're the silver lining in a story that otherwise might seem too melancholy or troubling to bear. Love's many faces, interpretations and meanings. The story of Selene and Endymion has captivated audiences for more than 2,000 years. But that long history has also meant that different eras and cultures have interpreted the myth in remarkably different ways. What the ancient Greeks saw in this tale isn't necessarily what Renaissance artists understood from it, and neither perspective matches how modern psychologists or feminists might analyze the relationship. Looking at these various interpretations helps us understand not just the myth itself, but how stories evolve and change meaning as they pass through different cultural contexts. For the ancient Greeks, who first told and retold this story, the primary themes seem to have centered on the intersection of divine and mortal realms, the nature of beauty, and the relationship between love and mortality. Greek culture was deeply concerned with the concept of kalos kagathos, the unity of physical beauty and moral goodness. Endymion's extraordinary beauty wasn't just aesthetic. It was a sign of something exceptional about his nature that made him worthy of divine attention. Selene's love for him validated his worthiness, while simultaneously demonstrating the power of beauty to transcend even the divide between immortal and mortal. The eternal sleep could be read as a meditation on the fleeting nature of youth and beauty. In a culture without modern medicine or cosmetics, the effects of aging were stark and unavoidable. A beautiful young person would, within a relatively short time, become worn by labor, weathered by sun, marked by illness and injury. The Greeks were acutely aware of how quickly physical beauty faded. Endymion's eternal sleep represented a fantasy of preservation, a way to stop time and prevent the inevitable degradation that came with continued living. That this preservation came at the cost of consciousness added the necessary tragic element that Greek audiences expected from their myths. There's also a clear element of wish fulfillment in the story, particularly from a male perspective. What man wouldn't want to be so beautiful that a goddess fell in love with him? What mortal wouldn't desire to be chosen by the divine, to be literally elevated from ordinary human existence into a realm of eternal youth? The myth offered a kind of immortality that was perhaps more appealing than the Greek afterlife in Hades's gloomy underworld. Better to sleep forever in a cave, visited nightly by a loving goddess than to become a dim shade wandering the darkness below ground. From Selene's perspective, the story could be read as examining the limitations of divine power. Despite being a goddess with cosmic responsibilities and supernatural abilities, she couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of mortality in a way that preserved her beloved as a living, conscious being. She could petition Zeus for eternal life and eternal youth for Endymion, but she couldn't have those things and have him awake. This suggests that even gods must make compromises, that some limitations can't be overcome even with divine intervention. It's a surprisingly humble admission within a mythology that generally portrayed gods as nearly omnipotent within their domains. The Romans, when they adopted Greek mythology and adapted it to their own cultural context, interpreted the Selene and Endymion story through the lens of their own values and concerns. They renamed the protagonists Luna and Endymion, but kept the essential narrative intact. Roman writers and artists seemed particularly drawn to the romantic and sensual aspects of the story. Roman art from the imperial period frequently depicted Luna visiting Endymion, often in explicitly erotic contexts, emphasizing the physical nature of their relationship rather than the more ethereal spiritual connection emphasized in some Greek sources. This Roman interpretation reflected their culture's generally more open attitude toward depicting sexuality in art and literature. While the Greeks had certainly included erotic elements in their treatment of myths, Roman artists seemed to push this further, creating images of Luna embracing or kissing Endymion that left little doubt about the physical nature of their relationship. These depictions were popular decorations for sarcophagi, the stone coffins used for burial, suggesting that Romans saw something appealing in the idea of eternal sleep, accompanied by divine love, perhaps viewing it as a preferable alternative to complete death. When Christianity became the dominant religion in what had been the Roman Empire, the interpretation of pagan myths necessarily shifted. Christian thinkers couldn't simply accept the old gods as real divine beings, so they developed various strategies for incorporating classical mythology into their worldview. Some dismissed pagan myths entirely as false superstition or demonic deception. Others, however, saw value in the old stories when properly interpreted, reading them as allegories or as containing philosophical truths that could complement Christian teaching. The Selene and Endymion story could be read through a Christian allegorical lens in several ways. The moon's regular cycles might represent the church, constantly renewed and returning to fullness. Endymion's sleep could symbolize the soul's quiescence before awakening to divine truth. The cave could represent the tomb from which resurrection would eventually come. However, the explicitly sexual nature of the relationship and the fact that it produced offspring made this particular myth more difficult to Christianize than some others. And it appears less frequently in medieval allegorical interpretations than myths that could more easily be stripped of their sensual elements. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical mythology, with humanist scholars recovering and translating ancient texts that had been lost or neglected during the medieval period. Artists and writers of this era engaged with the Selene and Endymion story enthusiastically, creating numerous paintings, sculptures, and literary works based on the myth. Renaissance interpretations tended to emphasize the beauty and romance of the tale while downplaying or ignoring its more troubling implications. Painters like Tintoretto, Poussin, and later artists depicted the moment of Selene's visit to Endymion's cave with considerable artistic license. These paintings typically showed an idolized landscape, a beautiful young man sleeping in a dramatic pose, and the moon goddess descending from the sky, accompanied by various mythological attributes like her chariot or attendant spirits. The scenes were romantic and atmospheric, designed to evoke a sense of mystery and ethereal beauty, rather than to critically examine the relationship's dynamics. The Romantic period of the late 18th and 19th centuries found the Selene and Endymion myth particularly appealing. Romantic poets and artists were drawn to themes of impossible love, the intersection of mortal and immortal, and the beauty of nature and nighttime scenes. The English poet John Keats wrote an entire long poem titled Endymion, published in 1818, which expanded the basic myth into an elaborate allegorical journey. Keats's version emphasized the spiritual and philosophical aspects of the story, using Endymion's sleep and his relationship with the moon goddess as vehicles for exploring the nature of beauty, truth, and artistic inspiration. Keats's poem, though difficult and not entirely successful by most critical standards, demonstrates how the myth could be adapted to serve new purposes in different cultural contexts. His Endymion embarks on elaborate dream journeys and adventures before finally uniting with his goddess. The eternal sleep becomes less important than the quest and the ultimate achievement of transcendent love. This reflects romantic values that prized subjective experience, emotional intensity, and the pursuit of ideal beauty over classical emphasis on balance and restraint. Victorian artists continued to find inspiration in the myth, producing numerous paintings that depicted Selene and Endymion, with the lush colors and careful detail characteristic of their era. These works often emphasized the passive, almost feminine beauty of Endymion, presenting him as an object to be gazed upon rather than an active agent in his own story. This reflected Victorian gender dynamics while simultaneously offering a somewhat transgressive image of a beautiful male body displayed for viewing pleasure, with the goddess's desire serving as a socially acceptable frame for what might otherwise be considered inappropriate. In the 20th and 21st centuries, interpretations of the Selene and Endymion myth have become more critical and psychologically complex. Feminist scholars have pointed out the troubling power dynamics in the relationship, particularly in versions where Selene requests Endymion's eternal sleep without his consent. From this perspective, the story becomes an example of how even when women, or goddesses, hold power, they can exercise it in ways that objectify and deprive others of agency, treating the beloved as a possession to be preserved rather than a person with their own right to self-determination. Psychological interpretations have read the myth as representing various aspects of the human psyche and unconscious mind. The moon, with its changing phases, could represent the cycling of moods and mental states. Endymion's sleep might symbolize depression, withdrawal from life, or the unconscious mind itself. Selene's nightly visits could represent the ego's attempt to commune with the unconscious, to find meaning and connection in the dark, hidden parts of the psyche that ordinary waking consciousness can't access directly. Some modern readers interpret the story as a meditation on the nature of itself, particularly one-sided or unrequited love. Selene loves Endymion deeply and genuinely, but because he's eternally asleep, that love can never be fully mutual. She can project onto him whatever qualities she desires, since he never wakes to reveal his actual personality, preferences, or feelings. In this reading, Endymion becomes a symbol for idolized love, the perfect beloved who exists more in imagination than reality, who can never disappoint because they never truly interact with the lover as a real, flawed person. The myth can also be read as exploring the desire for control in relationships. By having Endymion put into eternal sleep, Selene ensures that he will never leave her, never choose someone else, never change or grow in ways that might make him less compatible with her. She has complete control over their relationship because only she is conscious and capable of making decisions. This interpretation presents the story as a cautionary tale about the unhealthy desire to control one's partner, to prevent their growth and change, to keep them frozen in a state that serves the lover's needs, rather than allowing them to develop as independent beings. Yet another interpretation focuses on the theme of preservation versus experience. Endymion's beauty and youth are preserved eternally, but at the cost of his ability to have new experiences, to grow, to live. This might be read as a metaphor for how we sometimes try to preserve memories, relationships, or periods of our lives by refusing to allow them to change, even though that refusal means we can't fully engage with life as it continues to unfold. The myth suggests that perhaps it's better to accept change and loss as inevitable parts of existence, rather than to freeze moments in time at the cost of genuine living. Modern retellings of the myth in fiction and poetry have taken various approaches. Some try to give Endymion more agency, imagining that he chose eternal sleep consciously and for specific reasons, making him an active participant in his fate rather than a passive victim of divine desire. Others explore Selene's perspective more deeply, imagining her internal conflict, her loneliness, her struggle with the ethics of her choice. Still others have reversed the genders, telling stories of mortal women loved by male gods or of same-sex couples facing similar dilemmas, using the myth's structure to explore different dynamics and power relationships. What becomes clear from surveying these many interpretations is that the Selene and Endymion myth contains enough ambiguity and complexity to support multiple, sometimes contradictory readings. It can be viewed as romantic or tragic, as a love story or a cautionary tale, as an exploration of divine power or mortal vulnerability. The fact that the ancient sources themselves offer different versions of how and why Endymion came to sleep eternally suggests that even in antiquity, there was recognition that this story raised difficult questions without easy answers. Perhaps the myth's enduring appeal lies precisely in this complexity, in its refusal to provide simple moral lessons or straightforward emotional responses. It asks us to sit with uncomfortable feelings, to recognize that love can be selfish as well as selfless, that the desire to preserve what we cherish can conflict with respect for the beloved's autonomy, that divine power doesn't necessarily equate to moral wisdom. These are mature, sophisticated themes that reward repeated contemplation, allowing each generation and each individual reader to find new meanings and new questions in this ancient tale. Echoes through art and time. The story of Selene and Endymion has been depicted in art for more than 2,000 years, leaving behind a remarkable visual legacy that allows us to trace how different cultures and time periods imagined this mythological romance. These artistic representations aren't just illustrations of an old story. they're interpretations that reveal the values, aesthetics, and concerns of the artists and societies that created them. The earliest artistic treatments of the Selene and Endymion myth come from ancient Greece itself, while monumental paintings from this period haven't survived. We have numerous examples on pottery, particularly on craters and other large vessels used for mixing wine. These vase paintings typically show Selene approaching or standing near a sleeping or reclining male figure, sometimes with her crescent crown clearly visible to identify her, sometimes accompanied by Eros with his bow and arrow to emphasize the love aspect of the encounter. One famous example from the 4th century BCE shows Selene riding her horse directly toward Endymion, suggesting the urgency and intensity of her desire. The figure of Endymion is typically rendered as an idolized young male, nude, embodying Greek concepts of masculine beauty, athletic but not overly muscular, with proportioned features and a pose that's simultaneously relaxed and gracefully composed, even in sleep. These early Greek depictions established visual conventions that would influence artistic treatments of the myth for centuries to come. The Romans embraced the Selene and Endymion story with particular enthusiasm, and it's in Roman art that we find the most numerous surviving representations of the myth. This is largely due to the story's popularity as a decorative subject for sarcophagi. From the 2nd century CE onward, Roman sarcophagi were often decorated with elaborate relief carvings depicting mythological scenes, and the Selene and Endymion myth was among the most popular choices. Why was this particular myth so popular for funerary art? Several reasons suggest themselves. The theme of eternal sleep resonated with the reality of death, providing a more comforting alternative vision than simply lying cold and lifeless in the ground. Endymion wasn't merely dead. He slept eternally while being visited by a loving goddess. The idea that death might be like such a sleep, peaceful and accompanied by divine care, would have been consoling to the deceased's loved ones. Additionally, the preservation of Endymion's youth and beauty forever might have represented a wish that the deceased would be remembered as they were in their prime, rather than as aged or illness ravaged. These Roman sarcophagi typically show Selene, often identified by her crescent crown or billowing cloak, suggesting her descent from the sky, approaching Endymion as he reclines in the entrance to a cave. The shepherd is usually shown sleeping, sometimes propped on one elbow, surrounded by his sheep to indicate his pastoral identity. Cupids or erotes often appear in the scene, sometimes pulling Selene's cloak or extinguishing torches, symbols that represent both the darkness of night and the metaphorical torch of life being extinguished by sleep, death. The craftsmanship on these sarcophagi varies from crude to exquisite. But even relatively modest examples demonstrate the story's widespread appeal across different social classes in Roman society. One particularly impressive example, now in the Capitoline museums in Rome, shows a dynamic scene with Selene descending from her chariot in a swirl of drapery, while Endymion sleeps below, completely unaware of her arrival. The carving is deep and dramatic, with strong contrasts of light and shadow that would have been even more pronounced in ancient times, when the stone might have been painted. The composition draws the viewer's eye from Selene's active, purposeful movement toward Endymion's passive repose, physically embodying the dynamic of their relationship in the spatial arrangement of the figures. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and through much of the medieval period, depictions of the Selene and Endymion myth became less common. The pagan story didn't fit easily into Christian artistic programs, and the resources for large-scale artistic production were often limited. However, knowledge of the myth persisted through written texts, ensuring that it could be rediscovered and revived by later generations. The Renaissance brought explosive, renewed interest in classical mythology, and the Selene and Endymion story was enthusiastically taken up by artists across Italy and eventually throughout Europe. Renaissance painters were particularly drawn to the myth because it offered opportunities to depict several things they valued highly: the nude human form, justified by the mythological subject matter, landscape settings, and nocturnal lighting effects. Tintoretto, the great Venetian painter of the 16th century, created at least one notable treatment of the subject. His painting shows Selene as a beautiful woman in flowing drapery, descending from the sky toward where Endymion lies sleeping in a dramatic landscape. Tintoretto's characteristic dynamic composition and bold use of light and shadow create a sense of movement and energy, with Selene's descent feeling urgent and passionate rather than serene. The painting emphasizes the romantic and dramatic possibilities of the story, showing the moon goddess as actively pursuing her beloved rather than merely contemplating him from a distance. Nicolas Poussin, the French painter who spent much of his career in Rome and became one of the most influential artists of the 17th century, also depicted the Selene and Endymion myth. Poussin's treatment is more classical and restrained than Tintoretto's, reflecting his commitment to principles of clarity, order, and intellectual content in art. His painting places the figures in a carefully constructed landscape, with Selene presented less as an actively descending figure and more as an elegant presence visiting the sleeping shepherd. The composition feels balanced and thoughtful, inviting contemplation rather than immediate emotional response. The 18th and 19th centuries saw continued interest in the myth, with numerous artists creating their own versions. Anne-Louis Giraudet's The Sleep of Endymion, painted in 1791 and now in the Louvre, became one of the most famous treatments of the subject. Giraudet's painting takes a distinctive approach by showing only Endymion, not Selene herself. The shepherd sleeps in a cave while moonlight streams down upon him, and Cupid pulls back some foliage to allow the light to reach him more fully. The painting's homoeroticism is quite pronounced, with Endymion depicted as an extremely beautiful, almost androgynous youth, in a pose that invites the viewer's gaze, much as Selene's gaze falls upon him from above. Giraudet's work was controversial in its time, but also highly influential, establishing a visual template for depicting Endymion that emphasized his passive, receptive beauty. British artists of the Victorian era were particularly fond of mythological subjects, and the Selene and Endymion story appeared frequently in their work. Lord Frederick Leighton, one of the most successful artists of the 19th century, created several works on mythological themes, and his contemporaries, Edward Poynter and John William Waterhouse, also explored classical subjects, including moon-related myths. Victorian treatments tended to emphasize the romantic and aesthetic aspects of the story, while downplaying more troubling elements. The paintings from this period often show idealized figures in lush, carefully detailed settings, with attention to textiles, vegetation, and atmospheric effects that create a dreamlike quality appropriate to the subject matter. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and artists influenced by their movement found the Selene and Endymion myth particularly appealing because it aligned with their interests in medieval and mythological subjects, intense colors, and symbolic imagery. These artists often emphasized the spiritual and emotional dimensions of the story, creating images that felt both sensual and ethereal, grounded in physical beauty, but suggesting transcendent meanings beyond the merely corporeal. Sculptors also found inspiration in the myth, though three-dimensional treatments presented different challenges than painting. How do you show movement and descent in static stone or bronze? How do you convey the contrast between sleeping and waking, passive and active, in figures that are both equally still? Sculptors solved these problems in various ways. Some created relief sculptures that could show Selene's approach much like the Roman sarcophagi had done. Others created freestanding groups showing the two figures together, with Selene leaning over or embracing Endymion in poses that suggested her active presence and his passive slumber. One notable sculptural treatment is Antonio Canova's The Sleeping Endymion, created between 1819 and 1822, one of his final masterworks. Canova, the leading sculptor of the neoclassical movement, brought extraordinary technical skill and emotional sensitivity to mythological subjects. His marble sculpture depicts Endymion alone in peaceful slumber, with the highly polished finish believed to represent the reflected light of the moon goddess herself. The smoothness of the marble surfaces and the delicate modeling of forms create an effect of luminous beauty that seems appropriate for a story about moonlight and eternal youth. Canova's work influenced numerous later sculptors who attempted similar subjects. In the 20th century, as artistic styles diversified and classical mythology became less central to artistic production, direct depictions of the Selene and Endymion myth became less common. However, the story's influence persisted in more subtle ways. Surrealist artists, with their interest in dreams and the unconscious, sometimes created works that evoked the myth without directly illustrating it. The image of a sleeping figure visited by mysterious presences, of moonlight falling into dark spaces, of the boundary between sleep and waking, became part of the visual vocabulary that artists could draw upon, whether or not they were consciously referencing the specific myth. Contemporary artists have occasionally revisited the story, often with more critical or questioning perspectives than their predecessors. Modern and contemporary treatments may emphasize the power imbalance in the relationship, question the ethics of Selene's choice, or use the myth as a starting point for exploring themes of objectification, control, and the male gaze, or female gaze. Some artists have reversed the genders, creating images of sleeping women visited by male gods, or of same-sex couples, using the mythological framework to explore different dynamics and perspectives. Beyond the visual arts, the Selene and Endymion myth has inspired musical compositions, from Renaissance madrigals to romantic symphonic poems to contemporary classical works. Composers have been drawn to the story's atmospheric qualities, its associations with night and dreams, and its emotional intensity. Musical treatments can capture aspects of the myth that visual art struggles with. The passage of time, the cyclical nature of Selene's visits, the contrast between movement and stillness. The story has also appeared in ballet and dance, where the possibilities of movement in space can express the descent of the goddess, the stillness of the sleeping shepherd, and the quality of their impossible relationship. Dance can show what painting and sculpture can only suggest. The actual approach of Selene, the way she might move around the sleeping Endymion, her gestures of longing and tenderness, creating a physical poetry that brings the myth to life in 3 dimensions and through time. In literature, beyond the ancient sources that first preserved the myth, numerous poets and writers have retold or referenced the story. We've already mentioned John Keats's long poem Endymion, but many other writers have engaged with the myth as well. In some works, it appears directly, with authors retelling the story in their own words and according to their own interpretations. In others, it serves as an allusion or reference point, with authors assuming their readers will recognize the names and understand the significance of comparing someone to Endymion or Selene. The myth has appeared in numerous anthologies of classical mythology retold for modern audiences, each version emphasizing different aspects according to the editor's or author's interests. Some present it as a straightforward romance, others as a tragedy, still others as a philosophical meditation on the nature of love and mortality. Children's versions typically simplify the story and remove any troubling elements, presenting it as a sweet tale of a goddess who loved a shepherd so much that she made sure he would stay beautiful forever. In recent decades, the myth has been adapted in various forms of popular culture, including fantasy novels, graphic novels, and even role-playing games that draw on mythological sources for characters and storylines. These adaptations often take considerable liberties with the original myth, adding new characters, expanding the backstory, or changing the outcome entirely. Some give Endymion a more active role, having him wake up, or even making his sleep temporary, rather than eternal. Others explore Selene's perspective more deeply, imagining her emotional journey and internal conflicts in ways that ancient sources didn't. The enduring presence of the Selene and Endymion myth in art and literature across more than 2 millennia speaks to something fundamental in the story that continues to resonate despite enormous changes in culture, technology, and values. Each generation finds something in the tale that speaks to their own concerns and experiences, whether that's the romantic fantasy of divine love, the tragedy of impossible relationships, the ethics of power and consent, or the eternal human struggle with mortality and change. Looking at the full sweep of artistic treatments, from ancient Greek vase paintings to Roman sarcophagi to Renaissance masterpieces to Victorian sentimentality to contemporary critical reinterpretations, we can see how a single myth becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting back the values and concerns of each era that engages with it. The story itself remains constant in its basic elements. A goddess loves a mortal and preserves him in eternal sleep. But the meaning of those elements shifts according to who's telling the story and who's listening. The eternal question: love or possession? As we near the end of our journey through this ancient tale, we must confront the question that has troubled readers and interpreters for centuries. Was Selene's love for Endymion genuine love? Or was it something else, something more troubling? This question has no definitive answer, but exploring it helps us understand both the myth itself and our own assumptions about what love should be. On one hand, we can read Selene's actions as motivated by deep, genuine love. She didn't seek to harm Endymion, quite the opposite. She wanted to preserve him, to keep him exactly as he was when she first fell in love with him. In the versions where Endymion made the choice himself, Selene wasn't forcing anything on him, but rather accepting his decision to remain with her in the only way possible for a mortal. Even in versions where she requested the eternal sleep from Zeus, we might argue that her motivation was protective. She couldn't bear the thought of Endymion suffering the pains of aging, illness, and eventual death. From this perspective, Selene's actions represent the ultimate sacrifice of a lover who accepts that she can never truly have a complete, reciprocal relationship with her beloved. She chooses to love him anyway, knowing that her love will always be one-sided, that she'll never hear him say he loves her in return, never share conversation or laughter or plans for the future. She accepts loneliness and unfulfilled longing as the price of preserving what she cherishes most: his beauty, his youth, his presence in the world, even if not truly present to her. There's something tragic and even noble in this reading. Selene becomes a figure of devoted, selfless love, willing to endure eternal separation in closeness rather than lose Endymion entirely to death. Her nightly visits become acts of devotion, a ritual of love that she performs faithfully across centuries without ever receiving acknowledgement or thanks. She's eternally faithful to someone who doesn't even know she's there, at least not consciously. But we can also read the story very differently, and many modern interpreters do. From this perspective, Selene's actions weren't about love at all, or at least not healthy love. They were about possession, control, and the objectification of the beloved. By having Endymion put into eternal sleep, she reduced him from a person to an object, a beautiful thing she could visit and gaze upon, but which had no agency, no will, no ability to grow or change or choose. In this reading, the eternal sleep wasn't a gift or even a necessary compromise. It was a violation. Selene took away Endymion's future, his choices, his very consciousness, all so that she could preserve him in the state that pleased her most. She didn't love him as a person. She loved the idea of him, the image of perfect beauty he represented. The moment she fell in love with him, he was already asleep, already unable to respond or interact. Did she ever actually know him as a person? Or did she fall in love with an appearance, a fantasy she projected onto an unconscious form? This interpretation becomes especially troubling in versions where Endymion didn't choose eternal sleep himself. If Selene requested it from Zeus without consulting Endymion, then she made a decision about his entire existence without his consent. No matter how sincerely she believed she was acting in his best interest, she removed his autonomy completely. She decided what was best for him based on her own desires and fears, treating him as a thing to be preserved rather than a person with the right to make his own choices, even if those choices would eventually lead to his death. The fact that their relationship continues to produce children, the 50 Menai, becomes particularly problematic in this reading. How can someone who's eternally unconscious consent to sexual activity? The ancient Greeks didn't have modern concepts of consent and wouldn't have asked this question in the same way we do. But that doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't apply ethical frameworks that recognize the importance of mutual agreement and participation in relationships. Between these two extreme interpretations, genuine selfless love and problematic possession, there's room for more nuanced readings that acknowledge both elements. We might say that Selene's love was genuine, but flawed, motivated by real affection, but also by selfishness and fear. She loved Endymion truly, but she also wanted to control the relationship's terms, to eliminate uncertainty and the possibility of loss. Her solution preserved what she loved, but at enormous cost to the person she claimed to love. This middle reading allows for complexity and contradiction. Selene can be simultaneously sympathetic and troubling, a character whose actions we can understand even while questioning them. She represents something many people feel: the desire to freeze time, to preserve perfect moments, to protect loved ones from pain and change, even when that protection might actually be harmful. Her story becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting fear of loss drive our actions in relationships. We might also consider the role that immortality plays in shaping Selene's perspective. As an eternal being who had existed for countless ages and would continue existing forever, her relationship with time was fundamentally different from any mortal's. What we experience as a normal human lifespan, with its progression from childhood through youth and maturity to old age and death, she would experience as a brief moment, a flash that appeared and vanished almost instantly from her cosmic perspective. Given this difference in temporal experience, perhaps we can understand why she would want to preserve Endymion in eternal youth. From her viewpoint, a normal human life would be over almost before it began. The Endymion she loved, young and beautiful, would transform into an old man and die within what felt to her like no time at all. The eternal sleep, then, becomes a way of making his existence match her temporal scale, stretching out the moment of his perfect youth to last as long as her own endless existence. But understanding Selene's perspective doesn't necessarily mean endorsing her choice. Even if we sympathize with her fear of loss and her desire to preserve what she loved, we can still question whether she had the right to make such a monumental decision about another being's existence. The temporal gap between divine and mortal existence creates a power imbalance that makes genuine equality in such relationships nearly impossible. Selene and Endymion couldn't be true partners because they operated on completely different scales of time and power. This brings us to a broader question about divine mortal relationships throughout Greek mythology. The gods regularly had relationships with mortals, and these relationships were almost never between equals. Gods possessed overwhelming power, could appear and disappear at will, could grant favors or punishments, could extend or end mortal lives. Mortals in relationships with gods were fundamentally vulnerable, dependent on divine goodwill for their continued well-being. The Selene and Endymion myth is unusual in that the power imbalance is so stark and the outcome so extreme. Usually, when gods had relationships with mortals in Greek mythology, the mortal remained conscious and living, even if they eventually died, as all mortals must. Selene's solution to the mortality problem was unique, and its uniqueness highlights the ethical problems inherent in the situation. She didn't just have a relationship with a mortal who would eventually die. She fundamentally altered his mode of existence to suit her needs. Modern readers, particularly those influenced by feminist thought, disability studies, and other critical frameworks, often find the Selene and Endymion myth deeply troubling. The reduction of Endymion to a beautiful, unconscious object mirrors real-world objectification and the reduction of people to their appearance or their usefulness to others. His eternal sleep can be read as a metaphor for various forms of social death, situations where people are still physically present, but deprived of agency, voice, or recognition as full persons. Yet despite these troubling aspects, or perhaps because of them, the myth remains valuable for contemplation and discussion. Stories don't have to present unambiguous moral lessons to be meaningful. Sometimes the most valuable narratives are those that make us uncomfortable, that force us to grapple with difficult questions about power, consent, love, and ethics. The Selene and Endymion myth does this effectively, presenting a situation that can be read in multiple ways depending on our values and perspectives. What we ultimately take from the story depends on what we bring to it. Those who emphasize the romantic aspects will see a love that transcends death, a devotion so deep that it accepts any terms just to maintain connection with the beloved. Those who focus on ethics and power will see a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating people as possessions, of making decisions for others that rob them of autonomy. Both readings are valid, and the tension between them is part of what makes the myth so enduringly compelling. Perhaps the most honest response is to acknowledge that the Selene and Endymion story is both beautiful and disturbing, romantic and troubling, a tale of eternal devotion and eternal imprisonment. It reminds us that love, even at its most intense and sincere, can be selfish and controlling. It shows us that our desires to preserve and protect what we love can conflict with respecting the beloved's independence and right to self-determination. These are uncomfortable truths, but they're truths worth contemplating. And Greek mythology's willingness to explore such complexity is part of what makes it valuable thousands of years after these stories were first told. A cave, a mountain, and moonlight. The legacy. As we prepare to leave the slopes of Mount Latmus and the story of the moon goddess and her eternally sleeping beloved, it's worth reflecting on why this particular myth has endured for more than 2,000 years, and what it continues to offer to those who encounter it today. The physical location of the myth, Mount Latmus in ancient Korea, is a real place that you could visit even now. The mountain, now called Beşparmak Dağı in modern Turkey, still rises above the landscape near the town of Kapıkuru, close to what was once Heraclea at Latmus. The region is known for its natural beauty, with dramatic rock formations, ancient ruins, and the lake that was once an arm of the sea. Hikers and tourists who visit the area today can explore caves that might have inspired the specific cave where Endymion was said to sleep, though the exact location has been lost to time. There's something moving about the fact that you can still go to this place, can stand on this mountain, and look up at the same moon that inspired ancient Greeks to tell stories about a goddess who fell in love with a mortal. The moon hasn't changed, even if everything else has. Selene still makes her journey across the night sky, though we now understand it as the result of orbital mechanics rather than a divine chariot. The same light that fell upon Endymion in the myth, whether he was real or purely legendary, falls upon us when we look up at the full moon. The myth's survival through so many centuries and its adaptation across so many different artistic and literary forms speaks to something universally resonant in the basic situation it presents. The love between unequal partners, the desire to preserve beauty against time's ravages, the tension between holding on and letting go. These are experiences that transcend any particular culture or historical period. Every era has found its own meanings in the story, because every era has had to grapple with the realities of love, mortality, power, and choice that the myth explores. In contemporary culture, references to Selene and Endymion appear in various unexpected places. The myth has inspired names for businesses, products, and even astronomical features. Several craters on the moon have been named after figures from the myth, a fitting tribute that connects ancient storytelling to modern space exploration. The idea of Endymion's sleep has entered language as a poetic way of describing death or unconsciousness, a phrase that carries with it all the myth's associations of preservation, beauty, and the suspension of normal time. Fantasy and science fiction writers have borrowed elements from the myth, creating stories about suspended animation, immortal beings who love mortals, and the prices paid for eternal youth or eternal love. Video games, graphic novels, and other forms of contemporary storytelling draw on the same themes, often without directly referencing the original myth, but nevertheless operating within the imaginative space that it helped create. The basic template, divine being loves mortal, faces the problem of mortality, finds a solution that preserves the beloved, but at significant cost, has proven remarkably durable and adaptable. For those who study mythology and folklore, the Selene and Endymion myth provides valuable insights into Greek religious thought, particularly regarding the relationship between gods and mortals, the nature of immortality, and the role of love in bridging cosmic divides. It's a myth that reveals cultural values about beauty, youth, consciousness, and the relative importance of physical presence versus active participation in life. The myth also serves as an excellent example of how stories evolve over time, with different versions emphasizing different elements and offering different explanations for the same basic situation. The multiple origin stories for Endymion's sleep, the varying accounts of whether he was king or shepherd, the different numbers and identities given for Selene's children. All of this variation shows that Greek mythology wasn't a fixed, canonical text, but rather a living tradition that adapted and changed as it was retold in different contexts for different audiences. For contemporary readers and listeners, perhaps the most valuable aspect of the Selene and Endymion myth is the way it invites us to think deeply about love's nature and its potential for both beauty and harm. In an age that often presents love as simply and unambiguously good, as something that should always be pursued and celebrated regardless of circumstances, this ancient myth reminds us that love can be complicated, selfish, controlling, and destructive even when it's genuine. The questions the myth raises remain relevant. What do we owe the people we love? Do we have the right to make major decisions for them, even if we believe we're acting in their best interest? How do we balance our desire to preserve what we cherish against the beloved's need for autonomy and growth? When does protective love become possessive control? These aren't questions with easy answers, and the myth doesn't pretend to provide them. Instead, it presents a scenario that makes us think about these issues in concrete terms rather than abstractions. The image of Selene visiting Endymion's cave, night after night, century after century, gazing upon him in silence while he sleeps unaware, is both romantic and melancholy, beautiful and tragic. It represents perfect devotion and perfect loneliness simultaneously, eternal love that's also eternal separation. There's a longing in that image that resonates with anyone who has ever loved someone they couldn't truly reach, whether because of death, distance, or simply the fundamental isolation of separate consciousnesses. In the end, the myth of Selene and Endymion is about boundaries and their violation. The boundary between mortal and divine, between life and death, between love and control, between self and other. Selene crosses these boundaries in pursuit of love, and the results are ambiguous, neither purely good nor purely evil, but rather a complex mixture of beauty and harm, devotion and violation, preservation and imprisonment. The moon still rises night after night, just as Selene made her eternal journey across the sky. When you look up at the full moon hanging luminous in the darkness, you might think of this ancient story of a goddess who loved a mortal so much that she couldn't let him go, couldn't allow time to change him, couldn't face the pain of loss. You might wonder whether her choice was noble or selfish, loving or controlling, a gift or a curse. You might reflect on your own relationships and the ways you try to hold on to the people and moments you love, the compromises you make between accepting change and fighting against it. The story doesn't provide answers, but it asks the questions beautifully, wrapping profound ethical and philosophical dilemmas in poetic imagery of moonlight and sleep and eternal youth. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the best stories aren't those that tell us what to think, but rather those that give us something worth thinking about. Images and scenarios that stay with us, that we return to again and again, finding new meanings each time we revisit them. So as the moon completes its journey across the sky tonight, as it has every night since the beginning of time, remember the goddess who fell in love with mortal beauty and couldn't let it go. Remember the shepherd sleeping in his cave, forever young, forever unconscious, forever visited by divine devotion. Remember that love, even immortal love, comes with costs and compromises, with moral complexities that no amount of divine power can resolve cleanly. And remember that some of the most beautiful stories are also the most troubling, and that both the beauty and the trouble are worth contemplating as we navigate our own relationships, our own struggles with mortality, change, and the eternal human desire to preserve what we love against the inevitable passage of time. Closing. The tale of Selene and Endymion has taken us on a journey from the heights of heaven to a cave on a mountainside, from the cosmic responsibilities of a goddess to the intimate moments of love and longing. We've explored this myth from multiple angles, seeing how it has been interpreted and reinterpreted across millennia, how artists and writers have imagined this impossible romance, and how the story continues to raise questions that matter as much today as they did in ancient Greece. Like moonlight itself, the myth illuminates some things while leaving others in shadow. We can see the beauty of Selene's devotion, but we also notice the troubling implications of her choice. We can appreciate the poetic image of eternal youth preserved forever, but we can't ignore what was lost when Endymion's consciousness was suspended. The story doesn't resolve neatly, doesn't provide comfortable moral lessons or simple emotional responses, and that's precisely what makes it valuable. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of moonlit caves and divine visitations, of love that transcends death but can't quite bridge the gap between wakefulness and slumber. Perhaps you'll reflect on the relationships in your own life and the delicate balance between holding on and letting go, between preservation and freedom, between loving someone and loving your idea of them. The moon will rise again tomorrow night and the night after, and every night to follow, constant and cyclical in its presence. Somewhere in Turkey, there's a mountain where ancient Greeks believed a shepherd still sleeps, eternally young, eternally beautiful, eternally unconscious. And whether or not we believe in the literal truth of the myth, we can appreciate the deeper truths it explores about human nature, divine nature, and the eternally complicated relationship between love and power. If you enjoyed this journey into Greek mythology and want to explore more stories of divine love, tragic romance, and the complex relationships between gods and mortals, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Myths of the Night. There are countless other tales waiting to be told, each one offering its own unique insights into the ancient world and the timeless aspects of human experience. Sweet dreams, and may your own sleep be peaceful, your own loves be genuine, and your own moonlit nights be filled with beauty rather than melancholy. Until next time, keep looking up at the night sky and remembering that every myth, no matter how ancient, has something to teach us about ourselves and the world we inhabit. Good night.